Hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan Boyarsky. I'm a venture fellow here at Newchip. Today, we've got a very interesting panel for Demo Week on industrial startup innovation. It's an often overlooked area of the startup space, but it is very important. And we've got three fascinating founders and companies today. The first of which is Michael Druga from Sinnovatek. Michael, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, Mike Druga, President CEO of Sinnovatek. We are a food technology company focused on sustainability in the food industry and basically using a microwave technology to pasteurize or sterilize to make shelf-stable food products like baby food, soup, sauces, and vegetable purees.
Very nice. Michael's based out of Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina, and has had some really great success early on. And they also deal with sort of test kitchens for people to try out food products, which is a really great way to find out what you kind of need for any sort of CPG startup that's got food. Next, we have Yuri Galeev of CONSTRUCTO, who has a really interesting company relating to permits and architecture and design work. Yuri, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Sure. So CONSTRUCTO is an online service for plans and permits for residential construction and remodeling projects. And what we do, we're replacing the old school cumbersome permitting process with a streamlined one. And we do a lot of great stuff with the design as well, like presenting the design in 3D rather than just the plans, and just helping with making the all things pre-construction way smoother and faster than they used to be.
Yeah, it's a much needed solution in the space because a lot of those processes are manual and tedious and cumbersome. And oftentimes people want to just get right to building. And so anything you can do to speed up that process or automate that process is a huge value add. Yuri, thanks for joining us.
Sure.
And then lastly, we have Peter Jurisic of Buddy, which is a really interesting app that helps track employees' attention and alertness to help potentially stop accidents or any other potential dangers on work sites, and just when people are driving or any kind of scenario related to pretty much industrial companies. So Peter, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Well, you just did it. Thank you. But yeah, I'm the founder CEO of Buddy Solutions. We're a first of its kind, I guess, assessment tool for workers, whether they be industrial or office workers. And it's changed a lot because the world, it's really the world of safety. And the world of safety used to be occupied primarily by industry and manufacturing and transportation, et cetera. But COVID has changed all of that dramatically. And it's now the world of safety includes, every worker, because you see companies, hiring safety people that never hired safety people before, like Facebook, Twitter, and Netflix, et cetera. So it's a remarkable environment, but challenging.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think that it's a place where I think that technology hasn't always caught up because we have the tools to really help improve a lot of different safety measures. But I think that a lot of sort of industrial companies, especially related to worker things, even like tracking time is sometimes still manually done. So I think that it's a little bit anachronistic and arcane methodology for worker safety, but tools like yours and a bunch of other software and other solutions are really coming into the field to really help out. So it'll be really interesting to see where it kind of goes as we progress.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. We're going to kind of just start diving into some different topics around this. Hopefully it'll be, helpful and educating to those that don't really know much about the kind of industrial field of startups. So let's go ahead and start with the first one, which is kind of the elephant in the room, which is, why is this different? We talk about startups. We usually think of like something super sexy like Facebook or something like Peloton that's, usually facing consumers, or even something that's kind of a little bit less sexy, like, software or some sort of SaaS play for businesses. But I think that when we talk about industrial startup innovation, it just goes by the wayside. But there's a lot of really interesting progress in technology and innovation potential in this industry. So let's go ahead. I'm going to start with Michael and just say, what have you found and how have you found this to be different than maybe your expectations or experience with other startups?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways where, a lot of times it's maybe perceived as not quite as sexy as a branded retail product, because rather than having potentially millions of customers, we may have thousands, hundreds, or in some cases even dozens of customers. But I think to counteract that is rather than the high risk scenario of going out to market and hoping that your product works. In the industrial sector, we're typically solving a problem. We're solving a problem in an industry that we already know. We've experienced that problem ourselves, and we've created a solution for it to go market towards our peers. So whereas you may not have the immediate 100x return of millions of users, it is a much lower risk type investment with consistent growth. And that's the way we've kind of built ourselves, is really to be more of a progressive growth story as opposed to a 1 in 100 unicorn type situation. And I think on a scalability aspect too, with a dozen customers, I could build a $20 million business. So it's fundamentally different that I don't need to go get millions of customers to have the same revenue potential as a, say, a consumer facing product.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great point. And I think that it's funny because it depends really on what you're doing in the space, but more often than not, there's actually a problem that you're solving. And it's funny, I noticed this right away when I look at dozens of pitch decks a week, and they're all the time, whenever I see something that's consumer facing, I will see businesses that don't even explain what problem they're solving. But every single time I come to an industrial company, I'm like, okay, no, this is exactly it. Like your company is a perfect example of that. Construction companies and design companies take a long time to get permits filled. Okay, well, we automate the process for this. Like, that makes perfect sense. So let's go to you next, Yuri. What have you found to be the case in this space, and why is it different than kind of, along the lines of what?
Yeah, I guess, as you mentioned, the answer on that is in the definition that it's industrial startups. That they pre-industry specifics. So for the person who's not involved in the industry, it's sometimes it's pretty hard to explain what it's all about. That's the first point. The second is that definitely there is a huge room for improvement into almost any existing processes. Like, for instance, in our industry in construction, even though the construction itself, we already saw the many startups who are helping contractors to, for instance, like run the projects. There is a software builder trend, et cetera, you name it. The pre-construction part, it's still Wild West in terms of it's like very old school, old fashioned process, very fractured. You have to work with multiple vendors to get your plans in place, and you have to deal with the building department. And that can be a real pain, especially for the small contractors who has no ability to keep all this expertise in-house. So they have to work with multiple vendors, and they have to spend their time dealing with the building departments, which can be another full-time job. So yeah. That's what we're working on, and answering on the question why it's different, because it's industry specific, and it's not easily to be explained to the people who not involved into industry.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that what's really interesting too is I think we don't often see the sort of total addressable market as clearly when it comes to a lot of industrial companies. Like, people don't think of, paying 10 employees at a company to deal with just processing permits as a $700,000 expense. But if you can come in and have a software that does the job of 10 people for 70 grand, that's a 10x cost savings. Mm-hmm. And now if you imagine that over hundreds, if not thousands of companies, there can be huge opportunities. But because these processes aren't like, people aren't doing market research on the fact that there are 10 people at a company doing permit, filing, they don't think of it as this kind of market. And I think that that's why there's this kind of gap, because you guys who are working on these companies realize that, hey, this can be done more efficiently in a kind of innovative way, adding some new technology. But other people might not even see that, and they might not even think to really see that. So I think that your kind of company is a perfect example of that. And then Peter, I think that yours is also one where you see this problem, which is, you want to track workers' attentiveness and make sure that they aren't at, potential risk for the company. And we have the power of a world-class computer in our pocket, in our cell phone, and it can track and do so much. And so you want to talk about a little bit about how you found these kinds of safety measures to be, I imagine, easily implementable. They don't get in the way of a whole lot, but maybe a little bit not as attractive to investors, because they might say like, wow, what's the purpose of that? How much is this really going to save? And kind of the journey of showing the value prop there.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think a very good question, John. So I'm going to deal with the sort of the challenges of investors first. And I've been raising money for years and years and years, and in the current climate, you typically find investors are really narrow focused, right? They come with predisposed disposition to what works and what doesn't work. Well, why would you do this? Why people are gonna, like, so for example, one of the things that we do is we make sure people check in the morning and make sure they're okay. How are you feeling? How much sleep did you get? Do you comply with the company's drug and alcohol policies? And the investors say, well, people are going to lie. Well, they're not going to lie. Not everybody lies. And we're not introducing something that is a new way of working. We're enhancing it. So the safety culture already exists. And so one of the challenges we face in regard to industrial startups, it's not a category out there in the investment community yet. So if it doesn't fit into the category, they're not looking.
Yeah.
And or it's too early, come back to us for round A. And so rather than looking at the opportunity, which is real and tactile, you can look at it and as per your comment, total addressable market, serviceable addressable market, like in our case, it's hundreds of millions of users, like hundreds of millions. Mm-hmm. Right? The cost of risk management in industry is profound. We had an industrial accident in northern Alberta a couple of weeks ago where a D11 bulldozer had hit a small truck. 2 people were killed. Well, they didn't hit it; they ran over it. And that the company that had that accident, it's going to cost them tens of millions of dollars. Tens of millions. Their stock is plummeted. The whole company's in shock. The site is shut down, and it was because somebody made a mistake.
Yeah. And those are usually preventable mistakes, I think, is the important thing. And I also think what's really interesting about your company is the potential future of technological integration. So I recently bought this Oura ring, and it tracks my sleep. And so it tells me if I don't get good sleep. And so eventually you're like, well, hey, people could lie. Well, you could eventually, for really high risk companies or, there's potential to integrate that. So we could say, hey, like, you didn't sleep well last night, which is fine. We will just put you on a job that won't result in, tens of millions of dollars of loss. We'll have you in an office. We'll have you, dealing with materials that aren't as dangerous. And so I think that there's a lot of potential with other kind of technology there. And I really do think that, everybody always thinks to get insurance, right? That's an obvious, okay, well, this will pay for the cost. But I don't think people often think to do the other very cost-effective things like implement a solution like yours onto their company and into their work process.
Well, so thank you. Well, as Yuri and Michael know, one of the challenges with construction industry, et cetera, is that it's usually reactive, not proactive, and our safety is all about being proactive. There's huge opportunities in industry to change the. It's really about changing process design, right? So rather than just let's fill out this permit, let's go down and file it, let's do this, let's do that. There's many different ways of doing things, but you tend to have people that are kind of just stuck in their role. There's a huge opportunity for innovation in industry, but I don't want to occupy this whole thing. One of the challenges that we face is with current trends, everything's AI and machine learning, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than just you're down to the basics, like stop using paper, start using technology, connect with your watch, connect with this, right, Michael and Yuri?
Yeah,
agree. Yeah,
and I think, Peter, that's a really good point too when we talk about investors, because oftentimes, and there's 2 things going on. I'll start with your first point, which is one, investors are much more advanced. And so they want to hear that you're using advanced solutions, when in reality, some industries are so far behind that even a little bit of technology goes a long way and can be a huge value add. The second thing, and this is going to transition nicely to as we talk about the difficulty of finding investors, which is I think that a lot of industrial startups react to the fact that there aren't a lot of VCs around this idea. So what they do instead is they say, Peter, you might say, I'm going to market mine as a SaaS play. Mine's a mobile app that people can use, and I'm going to go after companies that do B2B to C SaaS or B2B SaaS. And those are the VCs that I'm going to go after, and they will maybe invest in me. And then you're somebody that could say, I'm a little bit tied to government, so I'm going to go after people that are making government plays. And then Michael, you might say, I'm going to go after CBG because it's a little bit adjacent to that, and they at least know the space. And then what happens is there's no VCs that are just about industrial startups, right? And so I think that because people have to make do, it's resulted in a fracturing of people picking up these kinds of companies in sort of adjacent venture capital firms. And I think that that's made it so that there's never been this void or this vacuum where somebody be like, all right, I'm going to throw $100 million and I'm only going to invest in industrial VCs. It's not to say that there are none out there. I just think that there are fewer because of this phenomenon where you guys might go to other investors to, to get your money and to make your kind of cash flow in a position that you can really grow quickly. So let's kind of open up the floor now. Whoever wants to talk, tell me about the difficulty or maybe the success of finding investors and kind of some of those financial projections that don't show that hockey stick growth, but more of just like steady algorithmic growth that's headed towards, a 2, 3, 4x return in the next 2 to 5 years.
Well, just very quickly, one of the challenges is, they want is first of all financial projections. Well, you can put any financial projections you want out there. They're just projections, right? They're just this. But so they have to use their own insight into really evaluating the market. But I guess sort of the greatest challenge is they're all following trends, right? So if you're a new player and a new trend or a new market, they sort of, where do you line up with their within their box? And if you're not inside that box completely 100%, ciao.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
I think that's one thing that's I've found over the past month or two, as we're starting to open up conversations with potential investors, is we've kind of found where we do fit into one of those trends that Peter's talking about, that our technology happens to kind of fall perfectly into a trend today of people investing in sustainability, especially in the food industry, that there's a large push right now for cleaner, greener products, reducing food waste, especially feeding the growing population. And our technology happens to be very well placed to address those issues in ways that the status quo can't quite do it. So whereas I agree with Peter, a lot of times the trend works against you because people are kind of following the next best thing. Well, our technology has been around for a decade and the trends finally caught up to us, now we finally get to ride that wave, right, to the point where we are in somewhat of that sexy situation right now where I think we have something that's really kind of on trend and on market right now. So we're really trying to leverage that aspect, and same thing with our customers. We're acquiring customers right now based on that concept of, reducing food waste and increasing sustainability for these food companies. And we've really just, I'd say, dug in and kind of doubled down on the mission lately because it's helping further, the deployment of our technologies.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too. And it's especially important in terms of how you market and brand yourself to different people. And sometimes when you're talking with customers, you want to brand it that way, right? Like, hey, we're on the sustainability. That's what we've been about. And then I think that can be helpful when you turn around and turn to investors and be like, hey, it's not just that we're doing it this way. It's that we've validated this because this is what the clients want. And this is what our TAM wants. Everybody out there that might be one of our customers is also starting to get on this trend and really believe in these ideas. So I think that's a really great point. Yuri, how about you? Investors, what's it been like?
I guess the main problem in our interaction with investors that there is a lack of industry expertise on the side of investors, and we cannot expect them to be an experts in our industry. It's on their business, but what we have to explain it on the basics, and a lot of investors who we're talking with, they see it from the reflection of their own experience. Like, okay, 2 years ago, I tried to do the remodel in my house, and I remember it was a nightmare to get the permit and the plans and get it approved. And the entire entitlement process took almost the same time like the actual construction. So from that point, you start, getting some common ground with investor and getting into the details. And I mean, it's very interesting with our industry, with construction, and getting it more efficient, because it's pretty obvious the house in crisis. It's such a big deal, especially in the big metro areas like San Francisco Bay Area, for instance. And when you clearly see that it's not about lack of contractors, so to say, it's more about the lack of efficiency into the process, and just cutting the time in half for the pre-construction process, we can get more units on market, can get more ADUs, we can get more, livable houses back on market. It's pretty obvious, but still, with this problem, with the lack of expertise, industry expertise, with among VC and angels, we still have to narrow down our conversation to certain metrics, and that's a problem because when we, like for instance, in terms of our startup, we have been concentrated mostly on the product development, on our message, and even though we in the early revenue stage already. There is very little metrics what we can use and show to the investors besides, some simple one like, okay, here's the numbers of project what we sold last month or last 3 months. We cannot show them like how we penetrate the market, how we talk to the contractors, what the feedback we have from contractors, because they do not speak their professional lingua. So I guess that's a big problem. How to find the common ground with investors who is not involved into industry and just quickly explain what it's all about and why it's so important.
Yeah, if I may just quickly, I agree with Yuri. It's often based upon their own experience. So just very quickly, a conversation I had with 2 investors on a panel, somebody said, well, Peter, you don't sound very up about this. You need to be more buoyant. They're going, I'm talking about people dying. I'm not going to say that with a smile in my voice. Right. And then somebody else said, well, I don't think you can take cell phones on construction sites. I go, yeah, you can.
And everybody does. I promise.
Everybody does these days. It's a tool. It's a tool.
Exactly. I think this is a really good point. And one of the pieces of advice I give to almost all startups is that when you come to your solution slide and pitching and you're explaining what your business actually does, it needs to match the complexity. So if you're selling donuts, that's easy. You can do it in one slide. If you're some sort of complex back-end software that ties together security and some sort of process flow, well, that might take a little bit longer. But I think that for industrial startups, you also have to take into account where the investors are at. So even though, Yuri, your idea is pretty straightforward, Michael, your idea is pretty straightforward, even Peter, yours, right? You guys might have to take a little bit longer to explain the importance and then the potential of it. And say like, hey, this is a huge problem monetarily for these businesses, and we are solving that problem. And let me show you how it is. And I think that one way that you can kind of facilitate that conversation is doing a case study. So, and I don't know if you guys do this already, but it can be huge. Say like, give an example. Say, hey, this is a company that does $80 million in revenue a year, and they spend almost $1 to $2 million just on the permit process alone for all of their sites. And so Yuri, you'd be like, well, this is where we can come in and cut this to 10%. And they would happily pay 100, 200, 300 grand a year for our software if they knew what it could provide and how much waste it could cut out. And so I think it requires a little bit more hand-holding with investors of walking them through the whole process.
The problem here is we sort of like hostages of the modern startup culture because, and there is a good point here that we need to make our pitch decks like in accordance with the modern rules of pitch decks. Keep it within 10 pages, keep your elevator speech like the phrase of 5 words. I don't know. So that was a big struggle for us when we tried to squeeze the entire idea into the, for instance, 5-word description. There is a good thing about that it help you to clear your message, and get to the point right away. It's a good homework. But you're absolutely right. Sometimes we just need to be a little bit more detailed in terms of the explanation, how the things will work. Because besides, just delivering the message on our idea, we have to do some sort of education from the beginning.
Yeah.
I know from my perspective, I have an engineering background. I was one of the inventors in the technology. And for me, the hardest part was teaching myself and learning that nobody cares as much as I do about how it works. The intricacies of it. I could geek out for hours and talk about why this thing is so amazing and so great. But nobody other than me cares about that. So I really had to kind of teach myself to talk about what does it do? What does it accomplish? What problem does it solve? And how does that help my customers? And to your point, Jonathan, case studies is the best thing I can do. Luckily, we've had some great customers where we have solved real world problems. One of the ones we're working on, they had 4,000 tons of food product going to waste. Meanwhile, this is in South Africa. Meanwhile, the population is vitamin A deficient. And orange flesh sweet potato is full of vitamin A. So we got to not only address a food waste problem, but address a health crisis at the same time. So we solved two very large scale real world problems on one project. And using examples like that of how technology can be applied rather than just look how cool my technology is, I think it's that discipline that's going to help us communicate what we do.
Yeah, and I think further to that point, that's the perfect segue into the next thing, is that not only did you solve these problems, but you can do it while making money.
Yeah.
Not even like you're giving it up and like, this is, hey, this took us, a month long to solve it. No. This is something that people can pay for because there's an inefficiency in the space. And I think that, a lot of, there's a really funny scene in Silicon Valley where they're talking about starting to generate revenue. And one of the investors is like, no, do not start generating revenue. Because once you start generating revenue, they'll always ask, and the answer will always be, that's not enough. And so I think that industrial startups are not that. They are no, you have to have a path to profitability and a path to exit. And I think that sometimes investors are just a little bit less enthralled with that idea. But I think that the smart investors who are really cognizant of what you guys are trying to do will really get that. And they'll say, no. This company's going to make money. And they're going to make money quick, which I think makes them way more attractive for like a PE firm to pick you up, or even for, some larger industrial companies. They're like, you know what, I would want to acquire a Sinnovatek or a Buddy kind of, option, because I can just incorporate that into it. I don't have to pay for it anymore because it's mine, and I can start to license it to others in the space. And because they have those contacts, that can be a huge revenue source for them. So, Michael, I'm going to go back to you. Tell us about your sort of path to profitability and sort of, how that has either attracted investors or maybe even sort of made them lose interest a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, so we're about 5 years into our story. We've spent a lot of our early years developing, proving the technology, just getting it to market. So we've kind of sustained most of the losses. Most of that's behind us. We turned the corner in 2019. That was our first ever profitable year. Modestly profitable, but six figures. And from that, we've really looked at what finally worked, what finally got us in the market. And that was where in 2020, I hate to call it a pivot because it was always on the horizon, but we decided to find a different way to go to market. And what we did was, rather than trying to go out and push the product, we created a mechanism to pull customers to us, basically following what the automotive industry does. When you go to buy a car, you go to a dealership, you test drive the car, and you drive it off the dealership. We basically created a dealership for our technology. We created a showroom floor where our potential customers, whether they're large ingredient companies or even CPG clients, they can come to us and test drive our technology. They can launch a product on it. They can take something to market on it. They can get comfortable with it to the point where it de-risks the proposition for them, and it allows them to say yes. And that was 100% based on feedback, and all the no's that we got over those early years was because it was too scary. How do I adopt a new technology in my industry? We're in industrial space, we're fighting inertia. We're fighting the fact that it's been done a different way for 100 years, and we've come up with a solution. Now we've just got to convince people that solution is going to work. So we could think of no better way to do it than to let people come test it and try it for themselves. And that's what's blowing us up at this point. I mean, we're now raising based on a growth story rather than a development or a go-to-market story. So it's really kind of helped turn the corner for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And I was just about to say, before you said that, I was going to say you're fighting against the status quo, and it is one of them. It has the most inertia of so many different industries because they like the way they're doing it. And so I think that overcoming that and selling, and the next topic we're going to talk about is sort of selling to industrial companies, which can be tricky. And I think that free pilots or ease of use, anything that can make it really convenient for them, goes such a long way, because they're going to want this to be like a snap-on, solution that they can just easily integrate into what they're doing. And any sort of way that they can test that out or do a pilot can be huge. Yuri and Peter, what has been your experience on that side of things, selling to these companies and trying to get them on board?
I think is just a transition from the previous point that it is very good that we involved into the entire startup culture, because it's give us ability to be more agile and to learn quickly and just to iterate, reiterate, etc., etc. And I guess that's because our industry, for good or for bad, they're very conservative. So they just prefer to do the things how they used to do, and they're not easily convinced to change the process. So we try different approaches here because when you work with contractors, again, they're very conservative. They prefer to stick with their vendors or just the way how they do the things. It's just more comfortable to them. It's already integrated into their daily processes, and for them to change the daily process, it means that they have to rebuild it, put a lot of effort into that, mental, physical, money, time, etc. So we just need to come up from the benefit perspective, what that will give them. And when you show clearly, okay, so here's what I can save you in terms of the money, in terms of the time, in terms of the headache, and here's how it will affect your overall profit. That's when you start talking business. And so it's always combination of the presenting the technology and the software and your product, and just talking their lingua, being on the same page with them, and show and demonstrate the benefits of using your product.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I used to work for a company that did automated road inspections, and it was for municipalities. And so I would go around, and it was kind of like an industrial startup in a sense. And it's amazing how I was, young, dumb, and naive at the time, still am some of those things. But when I would meet with them, you have to speak their language. You have to know what their problems are, and you have to know how specifically your solution solves their problem.
Exactly.
It can be a really difficult conversation because of all of these things they're saying. With they're inert, they're conservative, they don't want to try anything new. And I think that there used to be this adage that was like, if you want to make a new product in an established space, it needs to be 10 times better, 10 times, more cost efficient, or like whatever it may be, right? There's that 10x rule. And so I think that industrial startups fall a little bit towards that because they have to be really valuable. Like it has to be worth the risk of doing something different. And I think
there is no way you can convince them to use the product or give them like a 10% efficiency increase. Like it doesn't worth the entire headache of changing the processes. You're absolutely right. It should be way better than the just regular process, so they can clearly see that it's worth to change the way how they're doing the business.
One of the things that struck me is the challenge in educating investors in a topic or a sector they don't know anything about. You can present the statistics to them. So for example, I could say that by the time, at this point in time, since this panel started, 41 people have died at work, like literally. That would have cost each company, $1.5 million per worker. And I can say that, we've got 2 paid pilots. One is at North America's largest mega structure project right now in North America, where 3,000 workers will be using Buddy. It's managed by Fluor Engineering. The gentleman that's managing Fluor Engineering is about to be made head of all of Fluor's infrastructure safety projects. And so you lay out those facts and you still don't get any traction. So what we've decided we had to do is like, okay, we're not going to raise any money. We're going to build a product first. We're going to prove that there's merit in it, there's return on investment, that we can sell this into market. So rather than spend a lot of time and money investing in trying to find investors, we're just going to build it, and then it's going to be more expensive to invest in Buddy down the road. That's not meant to be punitive, but it's just what we've been forced to do.
Yeah,
I agree. Yeah, and I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a really good point, because that's what I see in the conversation with my fellow founders from the other industrial startups, that there's very little chance you can get the interest from the investors, VC, angels, you name it, if you on the very early stage, like MVP or something like that. You have to have a product. You have to maybe be in the early revenue stage, so you have to very solid proofs to start talking to investors.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that they just expect more traction. And I think that there are 2 ways to sort of show that traction. One, Michael's way, which is here's the numbers, right? And then the other one is sort of like beachhead clients and say like, hey, we've proven that this works, and here are 3 people that you can call that use it, and they will explain why this is so valuable. And I think that people don't rely enough on those testimonials early on, because they can be hugely important for validating your market and saying, no, we've solved the product market fit problem. This is what people want. And, they are already giving us referrals to other companies that they've worked on in the past or that they know. So I think that stuff like that can go a really long way.
Yeah, if I may, just one other thing that's is of interest that I've discovered since working with Newchip and building this process is there's less interest in the quality of the management team than I thought there would be. I don't know what Michael and you're getting from your end of things, but we have a profoundly strong team that's world class. But even that doesn't get you over the start line without. It's just if it's something they're not familiar with, you could have well, maybe you could have well recognized former leaders of any size business, but they're more interested in does it fit within their box.
Yeah, and I think that is a really good point. I think that's a really good point, Peter. All right, so the last thing that we're going to be talking about before we kind of wrap up is exiting. I'm personally of the belief that a lot of industrial companies have a lot more cash to throw around and are more likely to acquire companies that make sense to them. But then there's the other side of that coin, which is that they don't do it a lot. The construction companies of the world, the manufacturers of the world, they will most likely just find a way to do something in-house. And so I think that it can be a little bit harder to pitch exit. But that being said, I think that, you are more attractive in the private equity space if you're generating, good EBITDAs or your profit margins are anywhere from 10 to 20% and steady. But it can be tricky. So have you guys started to think about exit? I know you're a little bit earlier stage, but is this something that you've considered? Have you been approached by anybody? And what's your sort of horizon and forecast for this, especially when you talk to investors?
I think you're right. Yeah, in general, industrial startups, I think they have a more clear path to be acquired by big industry players. Just because if you have some sort of like a unique expertise and unique product, which is can be a good fit for their portfolio, that's the way to go. In our case, we do not consider, because our market is super fractured. It's huge market. It's almost $500 billion, but it's super fractured. There is no such a thing like a big player in this game. So we, in terms of the exit strategy, we're more thinking like for the constant growth and becoming a nationwide provider eventually, and probably our exit strategy will be just to become a first big player in this market.
Yeah, and I think that can be the best one, right? It's, hey,
exactly.
Some construction company that spends $10 million in permitting has decided to buy you guys for $30 million because they'll make it back in almost the first year, and then easily can license it out to other companies, or make it back in the next 2 years. So I think that there are a lot of plays like that make a lot of sense. Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we've actually similar experience. The food industry right now, the M&A activity is actually pretty hot. I mean, there's a ton of consolidation both on the co-manufacturing side, where the big guys like Treehouse and others are just gobbling up all the smaller players. The same thing on the equipment side. Anything new and innovative, the big equipment guys are out there trying to have an edge. So, me and my teammates were constantly sending emails. Hey, did you see this announcement? Did you see these guys got bought? So it's a pretty hot space. I mean, I think there's a compelling story there. Again, it's maybe not a immediate 100x return, but I think the idea of getting a 10x to 30x return within 2 years, I think that's pretty solid.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I do think that there's starting to be more trends in like you're saying, that people are starting to realize that this is a very lucrative acquisition space. And especially with companies that have cash on hand. It can be very easy to spend anywhere from $10 to $100 million on a company that's already generating revenue, expands their business, can improve some process they have, or be easily integratable. It just makes perfect sense. And there's it checks all the boxes of why you might want to acquire a company. So I think that's a good point. Peter, your kind of thoughts or experience here? I mean, you're a little bit kind of more on the SaaS side, which means that in some ways you could be acquired by anybody, but also it makes more sense for integration if some company that could really benefit from you might want to acquire you as well.
Yeah, I know it's something you always have to give thought to. I think one of where we'll end up likely is because we're in the safety sector. When companies introduce safety applications, software, etc., the stickiness is typically 100%. Companies don't typically swap you out for somebody else because it becomes part of process, and the cost of change in that process is too difficult because it interrupts the workforce or workflow, which will only cost the company money. So we'll be in a very positive evergreen evergreen revenue space, I believe. And I think our exit, if anybody comes after us, it'll likely be somebody from the European Union or Australia, because in the the VCs we've spoken to in those countries are more forward thinking in this regard. But I have to say, based upon conversations we've had with potential customers, like massive customers, it's going to be an IPO.
Yeah, no, I hear that, and that goal certainly makes sense. So yeah, that was pretty much the topics I want to cover. I do want to kind of leave this time now. Is there any sort of trends or ideas you guys have about the space in general? That your thoughts, any unique insights that you guys can share with us from having been in this space? Just kind of open it up before we wrap up here.
I think from my perspective, I mean, it's a more exciting space than sometimes it gets credit for. I do think because we have a very focused market, and like I say, because we're so laser focused on solving a problem in that market, I do think there's a lot of low risk upside. I think it's much different than like a consumer facing where you put a product out and hope for the best, hope that somebody likes it and goes after it. These are more, we're solutions providers at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think the cost of marketing in this sector is low. You're not fighting for share of voice nearly as much as you are on consumer-based products. Your audience you're targeting is quite narrow, and it's easier to get to them. And you're just generally not competing for share of voice. So your cost of marketing is going to be well below that of many other sectors.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I also think that one thing to kind of throw in there is why it's so important to get strategic investors and strategic partners early on, because marketing is not about blasting Twitter and Facebook. It's about talking to the right people who make decisions at these companies where your guys' solutions can be really viable and applicable. So I think that that's another thing to sort of be very conscious about when you're building an industrial startup. Yuri, any thoughts on the industry?
Yeah, I just I'm thinking that at least in terms of related to our company, we have to work more on our messaging, because we are working on such a big problems with such a potential huge benefits to the society. At least if you're talking about the housing, that's a huge problem, and when you see the clear pathway how to at least make it easier and make it less problematic, we need to work on our messaging, to deliver this message to potential investors, to potential partners. And I think this conversation was super helpful for me personally, and thank you very much to you all. That was great, and a lot of things what we can improve and work on.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that, panels like this are really just to bring attention to the space, that you guys are working on companies that make sense. It's a solution. It's money making. It has the potential to grow quickly. And I think that just any sort of more light on what you guys are doing is really valuable. So Michael, Peter, and Yuri, thank you so much for joining us. I think this has been hugely helpful, and hopefully we'll get some feedback and thoughts on what we've been talking about here. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Michael, Yuri, pleasure meeting you. Be safe.
Likewise.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
See you, everybody.